You hand spin the flywheel, the engine catches, and it's running the wrong way. Drop it into a forward gear and the whole tractor crawls backward across the yard. Nothing's broken. This was normal. The men who farmed with these things tell that story like it's weather. Just something the machine did sometimes. It's one of maybe 100 quirks built into an engine that, by every rule of engineering progress, should have gone extinct decades before John Deere finally killed it off. And when they did finally kill it, they did it in disguise. Engineers hidden inside a converted grocery store, prototypes hauled across the country wearing a competitor's paint, men under orders not to tell their own wives what they were building. Hold on to that. Because it starts with the sound. The sound is the entire thing. Anyone who grew up within earshot of one recognizes it long before they can explain it. Pop, 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 pop. 2 beats, then a strange rolling silence, then 2 beats again. Most engines hum. This one talks, and it talks like that for a reason that has nothing to do with charm and everything to do with the shape of a crankshaft. Run the numbers and the personality disappears into geometry. Many 2-cylinder engines used what's called a 360-degree crankshaft, the 2 pistons moving in step, the cylinders firing on alternate turns, evenly spaced, smooth, balanced, forgettable. Deere built the opposite. They set the 2 crank throws, one to 80 degrees apart, so the pistons run in opposition, one driving in as the other pulls out, and the cylinders fire within a single revolution of the engine, one near the top, the next about a half turn behind it. 2 power strokes, almost back to back, and then the engine simply runs out of things to do. It coasts. For roughly 5 to 40 degrees of crankshaft rotation, a turn and a half, there's no power stroke at all, the whole assembly freewheeling on the stored momentum of that enormous flywheel until the cycle finally comes back around to fire again. That coast is the pause. That loping silence, sitting in the middle of the rhythm, is the sound of an engine doing absolutely nothing, balanced on its own inertia, waiting. 2 pops, then a turn and a half of pure coasting. The flaw is the signature. The competitors who built smooth, even-firing twins ended up with engines that sounded like a sewing machine on a workbench, and nobody in the history of agriculture ever drove across 3 counties to a show to stand around and listen to a sewing machine. The farm kids named it before the marketing department ever could. Johnny Popper, Poppin' Johnny. You didn't need to see green paint cresting the hill. The engine announced itself a quarter-mile out. And from that uneven little heartbeat alone, you knew whose tractor it was, and you could usually guess what he was doing with it. That's a strange degree of intimacy to have with a piece of iron. It's also exactly why an accident of crankshaft geometry ended up stitched permanently into a generation's childhood. Here's the trick that gives the whole thing away on camera. Take one running at part throttle, and short out a single spark plug. Kill the fire in one of the 2 cylinders completely. You'd expect it to stagger and stall. It doesn't. You'll hear it drop a beat. 1/2 of that quick double pop just goes quiet. But the governor leans harder on the cylinder that's left and holds the engine speed right where it was, that massive flywheel carrying it through. Down a whole cylinder, it never once threatens to quit, which tells you something important about how lightly stressed and how absurdly torque-rich these engines actually were. So where does an engine this stubborn even come from? Because by the early 1920s, the design was already swimming hard against the current. The rest of the industry had looked at the road ahead and decided the future had 4 vertical cylinders. More cylinders, smoother power, higher engine speed. That was the obvious direction, and most of the serious tractor builders were already running that way and not looking back. Deere went out and bought the past on purpose. In 1918, the company purchased the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company of Iowa, and the lineage they inherited reached all the way back to a machine John Froelich had cobbled together in 1892, a contraption widely credited as the first genuinely practical gasoline tractor ever built. So Deere didn't invent the two-cylinder farm engine at all. They bought a design that already had history hanging off it, and then they made the call that looked, from the outside, like the wrong one. Everybody else is adding cylinders. Deere builds its first true tractor, the Model D, wrapped around that old horizontal twin, and flatly refuses to follow the herd. Read it as stubbornness if you like. Up close, it was cold arithmetic. Fewer cylinders meant fewer moving parts. Fewer parts meant fewer things to wear, fewer things to fail, and, this is the one that actually decided it, fewer things a farmer couldn't fix himself, alone, in the middle of a field, 40 miles from the nearest man who'd ever seen the inside of one. The Model D ran a twin displacing somewhere around 7.5 liters and made all of about 30 horsepower at 800 revolutions per minute. Cylinders the size of coffee cans, an engine that loafed along at walking pace revolutions, and underneath it a wall of low-end torque heavy enough to drag a plow through gumbo without ever threatening to stall. It was not fast. It was never once trying to be fast. It was trying to be the thing you could trust at 5 in the morning and fix by yourself at noon, and Deere bet the entire company on a single conviction, that a working farmer, every single time, would take simple over sophisticated. They didn't hide that bet. They printed it on the advertising. They sold the absence of cylinders as the most attractive thing about the machine. And then, of all things, the government handed them the proof. Nebraska had just passed the first truth in advertising law in the country aimed directly at tractor makers because too many farmers had handed over too much money for horsepower that lived only in a sales brochure. The law had teeth. Before you could sell a tractor in the state, it had to be hauled to the university, strapped to a dynamometer, and tested, and the real numbers got published whether the manufacturer liked them or not. The very first tractor ever fed through that system, test number 1, beginning the last day of March 1920, was a Waterloo boy, the direct ancestor of every Johnny Popper that would ever pop. And apart from a governor that wandered around a little under load, it passed clean. That laboratory went on to become the reference standard for tractor performance across the whole continent. So the entire modern idea of a horsepower figure you're actually allowed to believe begins with a two-cylinder Deere bolted to a brake in Nebraska. The simplicity went deeper than the parts count, though, because these engines would burn very nearly anything you were desperate enough to pour into them. The all-fuel versions were built specifically to run on whatever was cheapest and closest to hand: distillate, kerosene, the cheap low-grade tractor fuel of the day. And the men who actually ran them will tell you, with the suspicious precision of people who tested the limits personally, that they'd run on vegetable oil or moonshine in a pinch. You'd start the engine on gasoline to get some heat into it, then switch the fuel supply over to the cheap stuff once it was good and warm. Which created a problem, and the fix for that problem is the part nobody believes the first time they hear it. Kerosene burns dry and it burns hot. Hot enough that under a hard load, these engines would start pre-igniting, the fuel lighting off early and hammering away with a knock you could feel through the seat. So the operator deliberately metered a thin trickle of water into the carburetor. Water. Into the intake of a running engine, on purpose. Just enough to pull heat out of the combustion and quiet the knocking back down. It sounds like something you'd do to wreck an engine. It was a line item in the operating procedure. And folded into all that flexibility was a single catch, the kind that bites you exactly once and then never again. You had to remember to switch the engine back over to gasoline about 5 minutes before you shut it off for the day. Leave raw kerosene sitting in a cold engine overnight, and the next morning it simply would not light. So the great omnivore that could eat anything had one unbreakable rule: feed it gasoline before bed, or you are walking tomorrow. None of this came with a key, by the way. You started these by hand, every time, and the thing you reached for to do it was a hazard serious enough that Deere eventually had to engineer their way out of it. The earliest Model Ds, the ones built from 1923 through 26, carried a big, open-spoked flywheel, wagon wheel style, and collectors still call those specific tractors spokers. A spoked wheel that size, spinning up to speed an arm's length from your body, was exactly as dangerous as it sounds. So in 1926, Deere replaced it with a solid disc, the so-called nickel flywheel. And even then, the early solid ones had an unsettling habit of cracking. The starting itself was a small ritual with real teeth in it. You cracked open the compression petcocks to bleed the cylinders down, set your throttle and your choke, rolled the engine up onto compression by hand to find the right spot, and then you spun that flywheel, hard with your whole shoulder, and prayed it caught on the right stroke. Catch it wrong and the engine could kick back against the turn, hard, with your hand still on it. And those open petcocks had a habit of spitting raw fuel back out as the cylinders cleared, which meant one of the genuine recurring occupational hazards of simply starting your own tractor was taking a faceful of gasoline at sunrise. And that 180-degree crank, the one that gave you the beautiful uneven sound, is perfectly symmetrical. The engine holds no mechanical opinion whatsoever about which direction it ought to turn. So if you spun the flywheel the wrong way on a hand start, or if you loaded it down until it nearly stalled and it stumbled across the wrong stroke, the whole engine could simply catch and start running backward. Exhaust blowing out the intake, every gear in the box now working in reverse, the forward gears driving you back toward the barn. That quirk we opened on isn't a malfunction. It's the direct physical consequence of the exact same decision that gave the engine its voice. The unmistakable sound and the run-it-backward party trick are the same coin, looked at from two sides. Then there's the cold start problem, and it got dramatically worse the day Deere went diesel. Diesel doesn't spark. It depends entirely on compression heat to ignite, and a cold diesel with that much displacement is brutally hard to turn over fast enough, by hand, to light at all. Deere's solution in 1949 was the Model R, their first diesel tractor. And the way they chose to solve cold starting a big diesel was to bolt a second, complete engine onto the side of the first one. The R carried its main diesel, a 416 cubic inch unit, plus a separate little two-cylinder gasoline engine whose entire job, its only reason for drawing breath, was to crank and warm the diesel beside it. The little pony motor even had its own electric starter. You'd fire up the small gas engine, let it spin and heat the big one until the diesel was warm enough to take over, and then it took over. An engine, with an electric start of its own, that existed purely to wake up another engine. Deere built a machine that needed a smaller machine just to get out of bed. You'd assume a design this baroque, hand-started, occasionally backward running, fed water and moonshine, sometimes hauling around its own auxiliary engine, would have been quietly buried the instant anything more modern showed up. It wasn't. The Model D alone stayed in production for almost 30 years, 1923 to 1953, the longest unbroken production run of any tractor John Deere has ever built. The two-cylinder family as a whole ran for roughly 4 decades, not because Deere lacked the engineering to build something newer, because the customers kept choosing it, and Deere kept being right about precisely why they did. And the proof of that loyalty is the strangest little footnote in the entire run. When the D's assembly line was finally shut down for good, the orders kept arriving anyway. Farmers still wanted them. So Deere assembled the very last batch out on a street behind the factory by hand, building them out of the leftover parts inventory because the production line itself was already gone. Collectors call those final machines Street D's, tractors so badly wanted that the company kept building them after it had officially stopped. But the same arithmetic that had shielded the twin for 40 years was finally turning against it. Farms were getting bigger. The work was getting heavier and faster. Buyers wanted more horsepower and more road speed than two enormous lazy cylinders could ever reasonably hand them, and the 4- and 6-cylinder makers Deere had spent 2 decades cheerfully ignoring were now pulling out ahead. Deere knew the Johnny Popper was living on borrowed time, and they understood something more dangerous than that. If word leaked that Deere, of all companies, was abandoning the 2-cylinder, the very engine its whole identity had been welded to, the competition would get years of warning, and the most loyal customers in American farming might revolt before the replacement even existed. So they told no one, not the public, not the dealers. In a great many cases, not even their own families. The engineers developing the new 4- and 6-cylinder machines were moved out of the main plant entirely and set up inside a converted former grocery store, working where no one would think to look. They were ordered to keep their mouths shut, not just with colleagues outside the project, but at home, with their wives. When the prototypes finally needed real-world testing, nobody dared run a green experimental tractor where it might be spotted, so they trucked the test machines all the way down to Texas wearing Massey colors, a direct competitor's paint scheme, with screens bolted over the engines to hide what was bolted underneath. Prototype parts were sourced from suppliers scattered deliberately across the country, so that no single vendor could ever gather enough pieces in one place to work out what Deere was actually building. It's since been called one of the best-kept non-military secrets in the history of American industry. And then, having buried it that thoroughly, they set it off like a bomb. On the 30th of August, 1960, John Deere flew more than 6,000 people, dealers, reporters, dignitaries, into Dallas, Texas, in what was at the time the single largest civilian airlift the country had ever attempted. The entire spectacle staged to yank the cover off a line of machines almost nobody on Earth knew existed. They called it the New Generation. And on that one day in Dallas, after more than 1.25 million 2-cylinder tractors had gone out the doors across nearly 40 years, the Johnny Popper was finished. The flagship of that new lineup, the 4010, would go on to be called the most copied tractor in history. Every rival in the business eventually chasing the design Deere had hidden inside a grocery store and disguised in another man's paint. And the engine it buried, the one that fired wrong, ran backward and announced itself a quarter mile before the green ever came over the hill, became the one sound a whole generation would spend the rest of their lives stopping mid-sentence to listen for, just to be sure they'd heard it,